start the session and welcome everybody for joining us and for the inaugural ClimateSavers Week of events. So we have been very fortunate enough that the ClimateSavers platform that Ian Kaplan was mentioning before has been created to enable such important dialogue surrounding the various actions we need to take addressing climate change and giving us an opportunity to collaborate post such events for this week as well. My name is Sami and I will be the MC and moderator for today's session. But before we kickstart the session, just a quick overview of how this session will be run. We have 6 expert panel speakers today. Each of them will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have approximately 25 minutes or so of Q&A at the end of the session. In terms of technology, most of you should be muted just to avoid the background noise, and I'll ask the speakers to unmute themselves when it's their turn to speak. And as mentioned, before we kick off, I'd like to introduce Alex Rosenfield and Willem Ham to just share a few words on one of the collaboration efforts that's happening in the industry before I introduce the panel speakers. So Alex and Willem.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll do the quick intro and we'll have to jump, and Bill may be able to stay for longer. But Climate Impact Capital is a advisory and investment firm focusing on deep decarbonization for large international corporations across the energy value chain, from upstream, midstream, downstream, and power. And we're very pleased to be kicking off this 2030 collaboration with ClimateSavers, looking to really bring together entrepreneurs, policymakers, visionaries around solutions that we can find ways to accelerate, bring capital to, and get in front of policymakers so that they have a policy that is, at the very least, is not slowing things down. I kicked off a collaboration session today in our areas of expertise, which is around carbon capture, utilization, and hydrogen. And I'm looking forward to kind of bringing kind of communities together around developing those solutions. So that's the short intro.
Willem, do you have any further words to add?
No, that's good. I gave my intro, and Alex did a great job, so I'll just be here for the rest of the session. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, in terms of the order of the panel speakers and to introduce their topics, we have Peter Fusaro, who's going to be talking on energy. William Sani is talking about water. Paul Walsh on weather and intersection with health, Elizabeth Baca on education and health, Michael Shank, who's going to be talking about cities, and Ron Dembo, finance. And so before we really kick off, I really wanted to set the scene and highlight and perhaps remind us of the why and the urgency and action to address the climate crisis and some of the facts that are coming out more and more as time passes. And one of the interesting facts when I was just coming up on my radar was some of the World Bank data, and it was talking about the disaster displacement being one of the climate change's most devastating consequences, and projecting that climate change will drive 143 million people in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia alone to leave their homes by 2050, with many coming from poor regions that have contributed little to global warming. And then other facts such as an estimated $8 trillion annual climate-related damages bill by 2050 to contend with. We have an estimated 570 cities at risk, with 0.5 meter of sea level rise by 2050 and 1 to 2 meter water rises over the next century, and an increase in frequency of around 2 to 4 times experiencing extreme weather catastrophes since 1980 that are anticipated if we don't tackle climate change now. So with those sobering statistics and facts, we do have some hope with some of these panel speakers who are actually doing fantastic things in the marketplace. And our first speaker today is Peter Fusaro, talking about the need to accelerate clean energy And he has actually 47 years in clean energy in both the private and public sectors. He has a very unique expertise and on the interactions of these sectors, which has given him some amazing insights on the impact on financial markets. Peter is the author of 17 books on energy environment and coined actually the term green trading and green finance, which describes the triple convergence of emissions, renewable energy and energy efficiency trading. So we are very privileged to have you, Peter, with us today, and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarmeen. And I also want to thank Ian Kaplan for convening. It's very important to convene to build community. Yes, I spent a long time in cleaning up the environment, taking the lead out of gasoline with EPA in 1976, co-writing an environmental impact statement on LNG safety and siting, working on the Prius with Toyota. So I have been there, done that. Now's the decade we have to accelerate change. And it's very interesting right now, we're seeing high prices in oil and gas again, and coal. However, you have to realize a lot of those assets are stranded assets, will never be produced. You know, the nonsense that we're going to drill in Alaska when it's too expensive, and that's not going to happen, folks. So we're in the beginning of the energy transition. Climate change, as we all agree, is real and material. We're at 419 parts per million. It's a global emissions problem. And the issue is scale. So a clean energy, and this is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, deployed $500 billion in 2020. That's compared to a $6 trillion spend in energy. So roughly a little less than 10%. We need to accelerate this into trillions of dollars. The good news is that solar and wind in the last decade have come down tremendously in pricing. So solar came down to over 90%. It's affordable all over the world. Wind similarly has had tremendous traction, particularly offshore wind these days. You're seeing offshore wind built throughout the world. And Equinor, the quarterly Statoil, the Norwegian company, is deploying $50 billion in offshore wind by 2024. Here in New York, where I'm located, we have offshore wind being built off Long Island. So the good news is, Houston, we have a problem. There are solutions. The bad news is time is not on our side. I've worked 31 years on climate change, and we have not mitigated 1 gigaton of carbon. It just goes up every year as we combust fossil energy. So we need deployment of more clean energy and less fossil. The better news is that green bonds have accelerated in market acceptance. Many years ago, I brought Sean Kidney to New York. He's the father of green bonds. And I'm happy to say that green bonds passed $1 trillion in December 2019 and have grown $270 billion last year. We'll probably pass $2 trillion in total. Now, global debt in the world is $100 trillion. So green bonds is barely penetrating that market, 1.5%. But the point is, there's a runway to move forward with green bonds. A great idea. The other good news is there are leaders in major energy companies such as Shell, Total, and Equinor that are decarbonizing, that get it. Shell is a very big buyer of carbon offsets. They've announced 120 million tons a year. They're having some problem getting there, but they at least it's directionally right. And we have the next wave of technology coming. So what we do at Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, University of Po in France, Texas A&M, and University of Florida is accelerate IP, intellectual property, in not only energy, but regenerative agriculture, in ocean technology, in forestry, to move the needle. And our timeline is a little different than going through a traditional venture A, B, C, D route. We go 2.5 to 3 years, identify the exit, the beginning of the process, and ramp up technology. We need to move more capital into this sector. There's lots of dry powder, particularly due to COVID in the last 1.5 years, that can be deployed. Renewables are ready for prime time. I taught a course at Columbia University 8 years ago on renewable energy project development finance. At that time, there was one other course at Yale. Now every single college in the US is teaching renewable energy, which I'm very pleased to announce. And we're seeing renewables now with 35-year power purchase agreement for solar contracts in Europe. That tracks very well with pension funds. Pension funds are below water as people age. Their actuarial tables are actually needing more capital. That would align very well moving pension funds into renewables, particularly solar, because it's a great investment for pension funds. Ironically, some of the Canadian pension funds won't touch fossil energy, and Canada is a major oil and gas producer. So things are changing. We need to move more quickly, though. And so this decade, we've got to move faster in solutions, not just solar and wind, but I was looking at Swedish tidal energy company. We're looking at BIPV photovoltaics that's built in the skin of a building. We need to look a little differently. And I'm happy to announce today that Hertz Rent-A-Car is buying 100,000 Teslas. So EVs have arrived for prime time, but I'm actually more interested in hydrogen. Hydrogen is really the way forward. We need to build the hydrogen economy. Why hydrogen? Hydrogen has water vapor as its emissions. Hydrogen can be used for transportation as well as power and energy storage. And there's a marriage now of renewable energy farms to hydrogen production. So we're going to see a lot more movement on hydrogen to replace diesel fuel, which is dirty, to use for distributed energy resources such as cell towers, mining operations. Island nations, there are 55 island nations that need to get off diesel and fuel oil and move to hydrogen. Hydrogen's a plentiful resource in the universe. And I'm happy to say there are 100 corporate members of the Hydrogen Council in Brussels. So there's your game changer. Not talked about too much, but there's experimentation in Norway in shipping with hydrogen as well as Japan, experimentation of trains in France and Germany, and maybe even airplanes. So this is also the decade of energy storage. Renewables, we all know the sun goes down, the wind doesn't blow, we need to have energy storage. So advanced battery technology is also taking off. It's not just lithium ion batteries, which are in your cell phones and also vehicles. It's zinc air batteries, airflow batteries. There's a lot of great science being deployed in energy storage. So what do I see as the way forward? Renewables will be the dominant market share of energy at the end of this decade. It's not there yet, but we've had tremendous cost reductions. It's more resilient to climate change. You know, people in Texas were blaming wind farms for the problems in Texas distribution. Nothing to do with that. That's nonsensical. We need a smarter grid. We waste a lot of energy. Some of the power lines in the Northeast are 120 years old. So we need to replace them to use smart grid technology, devices that can turn on, turn off electricity hogs. Cybersecurity is another area of growth, particularly in the utility patch. And what we're going to see is oil and gas companies diversifying by buying into clean energy technology companies. They're not going to create the technology of the future. They're going to buy into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And there's some really interesting movements coming along, which also gives us hope. We will now turn to the theme of water. And according to WWF, some of the daunting facts on the issue of water scarcity actually reveal close to 1.1 billion people worldwide lack access to water. And a total of 2.7 billion find water scarcity for at least 1 month of a year. We have, in the developing countries, inadequate sanitation causing problems for 2.4 billion people around the globe who are exposed to disease and health problems. And in fact, 2 million people, mostly children, actually die each year of diarrheal disease alone. So with climate change altering patterns of weather and water around the world, it's estimated that I think around by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population may face water shortages. So we are facing a very bleak situation on this issue as well. And today we have our global expert, William Sami, to discuss the topic of water, being one of the globe's wicked problems, and climate change is a multiplier threat. So just to introduce Will, Will is an internationally recognized thought leader on water strategy and innovation. He has been a sustainability and water strategy advisor to multinationals, water technology companies, investors, and non-governmental organizations for his entire career. Will is the founder and CEO of water strategy consultancy called Water Foundry, and is also the CEO of the Colorado River Basin Fund, the first place-based water-focused investment fund in the United States. He has further published 6 books and is also finishing a children's book on water. So Will, I'll turn it over to you to share your insights on the water problem, and also hopefully hear from you on some hope as well. So thank you.
Zarmeen, thank you for the kind words introduction. So Debbie Stowell, who you met a few minutes ago, and I co-authored a paper on water, a wicked problem meets a threat multiplier. So Debbie gets kudos for the title on this, and it's really discussing the intersection of water and climate, and also talks about what the corporate world is doing with respect to water and driving innovation. So with that, why worry? And it's pretty straightforward in terms of why we should be worried about water. Item 1, it's over allocated and undervalued. It was over allocated long ago, before we had any clue about climate change. It's poorly governed. I would say that that is a worldwide problem. Certainly in the American West, it's one of the challenges that we face. It is non-circular. We use water once and we throw it away. In the US, we use water to water our lawn or wash our car, and it's drinking water quality, and that's a problem. And then nexus stress, and Peter touched on this very nicely, that you can't grow food without water. You can't manufacture semiconductor chips. You can't do anything without water. So scarcity and poor quality really impact a number of different sectors. All of this is complicated by the impacts of climate change. So that is the threat multiplier. One thing, actually a couple things with respect to water, it's finite. We're not making any more water. And it's not fungible. So a liter of water in one place is not the same as it is anywhere else. And that's one of the fundamental differences between water and carbon. So what's a wicked problem? I'll spend just a couple of slides on this to really frame what are the issues here. There are definitions that lay out what a wicked problem is. The two that really resonate for me in the world that I live in terms of corporate water strategy and technology innovation, are the bottom two here, is that wicked problems hardly ever sit conveniently within the responsibility of any one organization. And again, I want to keep coming back to Peter because he talked about convening and collaboration and the power of that. And that is part of the solution to water is a wicked problem and the intersection with climate change. Some wicked problems are characterized by chronic policy failure. I believe that's absolutely the case with respect to water, and we certainly do see that in the American West and elsewhere. So if you think about how do we intervene and solve issues like climate and water, we really have to address public policy. So this is one of my favorite slides because it really speaks to the issue of all the stakeholders that need to be brought together to solve water problems, water challenges. And each one of these stakeholder groups has very unique attributes that we need to leverage. So the lower right, the public sector has size and scale, but absolutely has no speed at all to speak of. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, sit at the other end of this. So they have speed, they have focus, they don't have scale. So how do we get entrepreneurs to scale, and how do we get the public sector to innovate quickly and adjust to a new reality, which is essentially what we're seeing in the American West, where climate change and a number of other issues with respect to water are colliding with reality right now. Everyone sits in between, and this is not exact, but you'll see the private sector, depending on the industry sector or depending on the company, be a little bit closer to the entrepreneurs, the investors, or a little bit closer, or maybe a lot closer to the public sector. So if we really want to solve some of these wicked problems, we need to engage with all of these stakeholder groups to come up with solutions and leverage what they do best. And this is really critical. And fortunately, we're seeing a number of initiatives in the world of water that are getting us closer to solving water issues such as scarcity, poor quality, and inequity in access. So I'm an optimist. So I'm going to focus on what is possible and what we are doing to address some of these challenges. I spend a good part of my time working with corporations, US, non-US corporate and non-US multinationals on corporate water strategy. So helping them think about what they can do to have an impact. One of the companies and initiatives that they have launched over the past 3 years is the 100+ Accelerator Program that was launched by AB InBev 3 years ago. First 2 years, it was just them going it alone, identifying innovative technology companies, startups that would solve very specific sustainability issues such as climate change, agriculture, water, packaging. What they did this year was actually pretty remarkable in that they now have brought in Unilever, Colgate-Palmolive, and Coca-Cola. So now you have 4 multinationals that are engaged in working with technology startups in climate change, agriculture, and water. And here are some of the examples of companies that have been in the first 3 cohorts to address these issues. So they provide funding for pilots, they provide mentoring opportunities, and the ability to scale, which again is really, really critical. So how do we identify the companies? That's really important, but how do we nurture them and help them grow? A couple other things that I believe are really interesting. Microsoft, I'm quite sure most of you have heard of their $1 billion Climate Innovation Fund, which in part includes water. So again, they recognize the intersection of water and climate and are putting real money into investing in companies. They also launched a number of years ago their AI for Earth program, which taps into their core business capabilities and working with academic organizations and NGOs to scale solutions to address environmental issues. And then they also participate in a Water Innovation Impact Fund with Ecolab and other LPs, again, putting real money into identifying solutions to water and climate. And this is a recent announcement on the right from a company called Xylem, which is the largest pure play water technology company. And they are calling upon the water sector to drive down carbon emissions. This is a big deal. Earlier, we talked about the intersection of water, energy, and carbon. Well, getting the attention of the water sector, water utilities, and technology providers is a big deal. And I believe this will be transformative going forward, and hopefully we can accelerate that. And then also Xylem has made their own commitments to reduce their carbon footprint. So again, a lot of activity in the private sector, and also how the intersection of startups engage with the private sector to solve wicked water and climate problems. So That's me. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this.
Thanks very much, Will. And as I've mentioned in the chat, please keep some of these questions, and if you've got them in your heads, please put them in the chat feature, and we will address them at the end of the speaking sessions. We now focus on the topic of the actual intersections of weather and health, and where Paul Walsh's title of his session was A Matter of Life and Breath. By way of background, Paul is a leading international expert on the impact of weather and climate on consumers and businesses. His observations have been featured in the US on the Weather Channel, CNBC, and has been quoted in many global media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and the New York Times. Paul was the global director at IBM on climate and sustainability strategy, and is now the head of growth at Breezometer, an organization made up of atmospheric scientists, engineers, and professionals dedicated to improving the health and the quality of life for billions of people around the world by providing the world's most accurate and actionable environmental data and insights. So thank you, Paul, for joining us today, and over to you.
Great, thank you. And I had to just, can you see my slides now?
Yes, yes.
I'm the guy that had to ask that. Somebody always has to ask that question, so it's me this time. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and great to meet everybody here. I'm just going to take a few minutes and sort of give you an overview of Breezometer and what we're doing. But before I start, just a quick background on myself to sort of build on what was just shared. You know, my background really has been focused on helping people understand, and businesses and government understand, how the weather and the changing weather impacts consumer behavior, and then leveraging that data to create resilient solutions. And I've been doing this for more than 20 years. I've not written a single book, though. I've read a lot of books, but I've not written one, not yet anyway. But it's sort of on my roadmap. And I spent about I guess 5 years at the Weather Channel. So if you're a Weather Channel geek and you're a real super fan, you might have seen me once or twice, and really focusing on the discussion and the topic around weather, sustainability, and resilience. And we were acquired by IBM, which is how I ended up at IBM. But I got this weird sort of background that's really focused on understanding the effect of the environment on people, and how we can leverage the understanding of that to help people live better lives. I give you that background because that's really the context in which I ended up at Breezometer, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. As it relates to what I'm currently focused on through my new company, Breezometer, it's really on helping people understand the impact of the environment on health. And it is obviously a huge problem. And this is something that I hadn't really focused on before I joined Breezometer, but the fact that, according to the WHO, bad air quality kills about 7 million people every year, which is clearly more than COVID. It's something that happens every year. About half of that is indoor air quality. The other half is outdoor air quality. So it's in terms of where I am in my career, it's really exactly where I want to be, because I want to be doing things that both help people and then contributes to a better lifestyle and way of life for people. So it's a great sort of fit for us. Obviously, we've just saw the WHO just sort of revised downward the scale in terms of the amount of bad air quality that has an impact on health. And that's had direct impact in terms of how, even like in the city of London, they're beginning to reduce and flag areas within London that are more hazardous than would have been even 3 weeks ago, based on the new guidelines from WHO. So it is a big, gnarly problem that is directly connected to climate change, because, of course, as the earth warms and it becomes drier, we're seeing greater levels of air pollution. We're seeing longer fire seasons, and we're seeing longer pollen season, all of which, in fact, from a pollen perspective, is even the pollen is actually becoming more potent. And so the climate, the changing climate, is having a negative impact on a problem that we've been dealing with for many, many years. And it's something that people care about more and more. Even just a quick anecdote, of course, I work with a lot of media companies now, and one of the companies that I've been working with has been doing polling, asking people from a weather perspective, from a weather app perspective, what are the most important variables? The three most important variables are accuracy, of course, localness, what is the weather going to be like in my area? And the third thing, which surprised them, is air quality. Now, to be fair, they ran these surveys in the US this past summer, where there were massive wildfires once again this year, and there was a great sort of huge impact on air quality. So air quality became a top item, but it is a really dramatic and super impactful item as it relates to human health. I've been quoting Peter Drucker for many, many years, even when I was working with companies like Walmart and Nestle Waters. Somebody mentioned that I worked with Nestle Waters years ago doing demand planning. And again, the Peter Drucker quote that I typically quote, again, I'm not sure if it's exactly right, but he said, "What gets measured gets managed," and that is a truism. So if you can measure, for example, the air quality at a local level, and you can communicate that to somebody, and you can communicate it to many people at scale, people can then take actions to help them sort of live a healthier lifestyle, which is really the mission of Brisometer. So Brisometer was formed about 7 years ago in Israel. It's an Israeli company. The mission was really to improve the health and quality of life for billions of people worldwide by being able to provide those sort of actionable and real-time insights to help them make those decisions. We're about 75 people now. We were about 45 at the beginning of this year. We raised $30 million in Series C capital at the end of the spring, which has enabled the company to grow, which is why I'm here, to help sort of build the business here in North America. Main products are really, as I mentioned before, focused on air quality at scale, pollen and fires. We're working with a lot of really big companies, and we also have a consumer platform that I'll talk about in just a second. From a customer perspective, we have large autos. In fact, we're doing some really interesting work with Volvo, and there's actually a press release on it that just went out a week or two ago, where they're bringing this external data that we're providing into cars, so that when you're driving the car, it'll alert you when you're going to be going into an area where there's going to be bad air quality. Eventually, we hope that it will enable you to sort of navigate around it, and also control, like let you know if you should roll your windows up or down, but also control the sort of indoor air quality within the cabin. I just think that's a really unique use case. But we're working with companies like Dyson, et cetera, to help basically bring this data in to the products and solutions that they're developing to make them more actionable. Our biggest customer, our marquee customer, of course, is Apple. If you happen to have an iPhone and you check the native weather app on your iPhone, that's where you'll find the Brisometer data. And that's where we're getting closer and closer to Rand Korber's original vision, which is to provide this air quality information and external sort of environmental health information to billions of people, which sounded, I think, when he started talking about this 6 or 7 years ago, like very grandiose, as you would as a startup. But now we're reaching well over 300 million people just via the iPhone app. And we are scaling way beyond that as well, with some other things that are going on that I can't talk about yet, but we will be talking about over the next 6 to 12 months as we're scaling out the data that we've created. Hang on just a second. And so that basically, I know I'm running through this pretty quickly, but this is us. And then Michael, when we did the initial discussion, Michael was talking about the air quality in Uganda. This data is available in Uganda. So if you go to brisometer.com, you can get the data, or you can download it, and there's an app. And it's exactly developed for people like Michael, who's on the call, who some of you might not have heard, but he was talking about the problem of air quality and health in Uganda, and how important it is to sort of keep track of that and sort of manage your lifestyle around that. I feel like I went really fast here. But this is my actually last slide, so we can answer questions, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth actually to fill in the gaps as it relates to health on the back of this.
Great, and thank you so much, Paul. And yes, it is a very nice segue and continuing segue on the topic of health, and also coming up with various themes if people have started to observe communication, education, measuring that matters, and with the role of education and the intersection of health. Elizabeth Baca is a clinical strategist who provides systems thinking and insights into healthcare and life sciences companies to support care delivery innovation to foster total health and well-being, recognizing health equity and sustainability being central to her work. She has worked both with the private and public sector in areas including the future of health, health planning for resilient and climate smart communities, healthy food systems, big data, and public-private partnerships. She joins us today to speak on education and health, with the title of her session being The Human Side of Climate Change, Taking Action to Protect Our Health. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Wonderful. Thanks, Armine. And it was really, so when Paul and I got to connect, I was so excited because I've been thinking about how we use environmental health data. And so I had noticed that it was actually just showed up in my iPhone one day. So that was really exciting. So it's great to talk about the human side. One, just even Paul, as you were talking about, you know, in the future, as we think about the future and the future of health and how these things all intersect. I recently, as you mentioned, I live in Northern California. We've been having a really bad wildfire season, not just this season. It's something that we're seeing more and more. So this is happening, you know, increasingly. And I recently had to take a trip to the Bay Area. And in my own home, I have air purifiers, I have an air quality monitor. And the big thing was when I got in the car, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a young daughter. And it's like, this is going to be bad air quality as we transit through this. So it's so fascinating to see that we're at this intersection now. But basically, I wanted to share a little bit about health and the kind of the human side. I think we often spend a lot of time thinking about the complex policies, and I was on the policy side, or thinking really about the carbon or these other components. And ultimately, I think there's this huge opportunity because this is really impacting each and every one of us. And it's not necessarily into the future, it's impacting us in the here and now. So I spend a lot of time thinking about these connections with health. You might wonder, how in the world is a clinician who's working on strategy thinking about climate resilience? So I wanted to provide a little bit of context, and Paul, I agree, Michael, as you opened up the conversation with your experience with your kids on a daily level in air quality is very much the experience I was having as a pediatrician. So I spent my clinical time, I was on faculty at Stanford and was really working with populations, a federally qualified health center. So really with populations that had greater health disparities. And what I saw pretty quickly was that they were suffering from a lot of the social, economic, and particularly environmental factors, things around asthma, but also childhood obesity. So the more I spent time working on these issues, the more I realized that there were these broader systemic and societal issues that we needed to action on. And what was really interesting is I ended up transitioning from my time in clinical medicine to work with the governor's office. And as I did that, we were working on a lot of solutions to support total health, right? So how do we create healthy communities? How do we create, access to healthy food? What kinds of things do we need structurally to improve health? It ended up being a lot of the same things because I was also working on the climate policy. So a lot of the things we were trying to do from a climate lens, and California has a lot of very progressive policies, ended up being the same. As an example, if you're working on food systems change, you may be working to reduce food waste. That's some of the legislation we have here. And so by doing that, you reduce the methane emissions. But at the same time you're doing that, there's a lot of food, instead of it being wasted, it can go to individuals that are in high need. So it's going to actually help meet individuals from that perspective. Same, we've talked about it a little bit in terms of transportation. Can we, decarbonize our transportation system so that we're having less emissions and having a better ability for walkability or active transportation? So lots and lots of areas of overlap. And, so now in my time with Deloitte, we spend a lot of time working with private sector clients and beyond. But I think what's really exciting is we're seeing a huge push towards this recognition and the link around climate and health. So as we're all leading up to the next COP for the climate negotiations, there's a new report that's coming out and a lot of emphasis on health going into that. We also see that in the midst of a global pandemic, so we're all getting to join here by video today. We wouldn't have done that necessarily before. It's really upended our lives and changed our lives for many ways. But what we now have is over 200 medical journals coming together to recognize how important it is that climate change is having this impact on health and to take action. The other thing, and this is by country, a lot of movement in terms of for instance, the National Academy of Science in the US has come together and launched a public-private initiative or a grand challenge to really start to take action. So I'm optimistic because I see all of these amazing forces coming together that allow us to really think about our future in a different way, and using health as that lever to really catalyze a lot of these actions for climate change. So a couple of things I wanted to just mention, in terms of what some of those actions could be. I think, and it's going to take everybody here to do that. One is just as Paul mentioned, so there's, we know that climate is having an impact. So direct impacts on health is really the first step, just recognizing those direct impacts. So, severe storms, wildfires, droughts, high heat days, all of those things then have direct health impacts. So the first part, I think, is education. So that's part of my talk, was to talk about education. One of the things that we actually just did for Deloitte is an educational session for all 345,000 plus employees, which is pretty amazing. And yours truly did a small section, but on the connections with health. What I would say is really amazing is I've already had, and we're a global company, is folks from all over the world sending notes saying, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. I never really thought about this connection. So I think that's the first part, is just being able to make those connections. And that can be through any conversations that you're having, any of the folks that you're doing, for whether it be on resilience for your cities or for transportation or energy, is just highlighting those links between health and these actions, I think, is the first step. The other is that we can start to, I think one of the things that's particularly interesting around health is that we have this opportunity to move from just mitigation. Just mitigation is hugely important. We've got to mitigate, but recognizing that we're already at this place where there are some things that are already underway and already happening. And so we need to respond to that. So I think about it in terms of, and I'm seeing a lot of really promising examples from companies, from governments starting to think this way as well, but mitigation, so reducing harm. The second piece is adaptation and resilience. So how do we, in the face of these things, recognize that we're going to have this? How do we start to think about things like artificial intelligence? I love that there's the artificial intelligence for Earth. How do we think about artificial intelligence for our health? And I think even, Paul, using some of the data that you guys are creating to be more proactive and predictive. And then the last thing I would say is really thinking about value creation. So as we think about care models, as we think about how we, fully support individuals in their health, working with a lot of different partners and stakeholders interested in health to get there, I think there's a tremendous opportunity. So I think I'm at my time, but I'm really excited about the conversation. And what I think is so exciting about this type of group coming together is, Will, to your point, this is a wicked problem, and this kind of falls across everybody, but then, nobody's responsible. And so I think the flip side is it's everybody's responsible. And I think these types of conversations help lend to solutions. So I'm excited for the Q&A. Thanks,
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And yeah, I'm looking forward to actually, when I do open up the floor to all of you panel speakers as well, I can see lots of interconnections. And I think, Elizabeth, when we caught up, you mentioned the word systems thinking. And I know that in the area of work in the impact investing world, that is one of the constant educational pieces that I'm also sharing in the community, in the investment community, that stop thinking in verticals and start thinking across and interconnections. So yeah, looking forward to that conversation. And now we actually turn to the built environment, and our guest panel speaker is Michael Shank. Michael is the Director of Communications on Carbon Neutral Cities Alliances, and in his role, he supports Alliance members' efforts to communicate ambitious climate action to public, the press, and policymakers. As a climate communicator, Michael's past clients include the United Nations and member states, the US Congress and administration, and even the Vatican. Michael's PhD in climate conflict. Michael has a PhD in climate conflict, and he teaches sustainable development and climate security graduate classes at NUI. NYU, sorry, and for the Center of Global Affairs. And today, Michael will be sharing his insights on how communication plays a key role in terms of mind shifts in relation to climate change, with specific references to cities, building public and political will for greener cities. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Armin. And hopefully this is a natural extension from Elizabeth's conversation on education and communication and making it tangible and palatable for the publics and for policymakers. And health is such an easy way to do that because it is so obvious. And I do think, given this year's extreme weather events, which are happening with much more frequency and ferocity, we do have an opportunity because of the tragedy to talk about it in a way that keeps it timely and topical, and it's in people's minds because of the devastation. This has been an awful year. It's been an expensive year when it comes to extreme weather because of climate change. So this is our opportunity to message. I think about this stuff all the time. I obsess about this stuff. How do we build public and political will? I used to work in Congress doing the same. Then I moved to the UN and helped the SDG rollout in terms of communicating the Sustainable Development Goals around the world. And I moved to cities because cities have an opportunity to move faster and perhaps decarbonize grids and systems more quickly than national government. So I needed that immediacy. And so now I'm working with cities. Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, it's a small group. It's not C40 for those of you who know city organizations. Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance is much smaller. We work with 20 plus cities around the world that early on committed to really ambitious targets and timelines. So the Copenhagens and the Oslos and the Stockholms, US stateside here, it's New York City, Seattle, Portland, et cetera, and then a few in Australia. We even have Yokohama as a member. So it was the cities that were committing early to carbon neutrality. Now that date, that carbon neutrality by 2050 is old news. And some of our cities like Copenhagen have ratcheted that up pretty significantly and are committing to carbon neutrality by 2025. So we're seeing those targets and timelines change, given both the support, the public and political will for it, but also the science is clearly naming it. Now, I have this here as my opening slide because if we do just this with all the aforementioned presentations, if we do more of this, we'll get a lot faster and further in our winning the hearts and minds. And that's from the left to the right, starting with the values of the audience. We know this. I mean, I feel like I'm definitely speaking to the choir here. You all are very embedded in this work. You know this well. However, it's amazing to me in the climate space how we still continue to beat the climate science drum. Hopefully, at least in the US, there's the hope that we'll still win some new hearts and minds. And I think that that data division is long past, and I don't think we're building that bridge anytime soon. I do think the opportunity to work on values, what people care about, basic human needs, is real. We should exploit that versus really doubling down on agreement around science presently. And I say that from the state of Vermont, where we have a core of people who will never get on board the science, but who might change their behavior because life is better because of it. So that's really what I'm going to talk about here. And then the middle and to the right, these are no-brainers, using creative visuals to convey the message and showing local impact. So that's really where I'm taking the conversation. I'm just going to flag these. I already put these in chat. I wrote a bunch of resources for Apolitical, whom some of you might know, based in London, based in Berlin, providing resources to government officials at all levels of government around the world. These are there in chat for more exhaustive deep dives. And if we want to do a later session on any of these, I know Ian is making that available. Happy to do that. These are resources I provide my cities and other government officials. ClimateVisuals.org emphasizes this, and this is really where I spend a lot of my time with my cities as they're decarbonizing the grids, as they're transforming both the building sector and transportation and waste, which some of you have already mentioned, those frontiers of work in terms of decarbonization and retrofit. This is where I'm encouraging them to go. This is new ground for a lot of cities because a lot of these sustainability leads, climate leads, environmental leads got their masters and PhDs in the science space. They didn't see themselves necessarily as change agents. Maybe they got their MPAs and sure, they thought themselves as thought leaders, but I'm really encouraging our cities to tell stories with this, real people, real stories, local impacts. And not just having the deep dive with the 80-page PDF or the 100-page PDF of climate planning, which is where our city spent a lot of time previously, which they needed to do to convince the city council, hey, we've got this. Here's our plan, here's our strategy. That was necessary. Now, how do we pivot to storytelling? And that's where I'm taking a lot of our members. London, just this year, for any of you who live in London, know very well the air pollution problem in London, and that it's killing lots of people in London. And just this year, the mayor rolled this out. Again, they're one of our members, and I really like what they've done here, because if you think of visual storytelling, they've named it. This is captivating. If you're walking along the street in terms of building public and political will, this does it. Not only is the data visualized in a really compelling way, it's getting your attention. It's very visceral. We know visuals work, and yet it's amazing in the data space and the science space how infrequently we use them. And so really encouraging, again, my cities to visualize, both the problem and the solution. And to tap into the values, the basic human needs. How is life going to be better for the public? How is life going to be better when they transition their homes to heat pumps and solar and Powerwall batteries and they get an EV? How is life going to be better when they scale up plant-based diets, when they buy sustainable fashion? How is life going to be better? When we talk about building electrification in terms of built environment, is this the deep dive we do with the publics and policymakers, or do we just tap into basic human needs? Hey folks, and this is from NYSERDA in New York. For those of you who know NYSERDA and worked with them before, this is the messaging. Hey, it's gonna be more comfortable, it's gonna be less maintenance, it's gonna be safer, and cheaper. How do we sell that really proactively, storytell it so that the public's like, I get it. And it's really not about the climate science. It's really not about retrofit. It's not about deep decarbonization. Those aren't words they're using, so let's not use them either. In the embodied carbon space, our European members are scaling this up. Our US members are starting to, in terms of city efforts, to really focus on embodied carbon. So exciting work happening in Europe in this space. Do I spend time doing deep dives on this front or encouraging our cities to do so too? No, of course not. How is life going to be better with a greener building? And the opportunities here abound in terms of storytelling this stuff in ways that employees or CEOs or building managers can get their heads around. Same with congestion pricing schemes, and Europe does a good job of this in terms of Stockholm and London, et cetera. But when we talk about car-free cities, in terms of retrofitting transportation systems so that they're greener, how do we show that life is going to be better? And what New York City has done a good job of is rolling out these carve-outs, these plazas where they shut down streets for 3 months at a time. They just call it a pilot. Hey, New York, we're not taking away your rights. We're not taking away your access. We're just going to pilot this plaza for 3 months, see how it goes. People love it. They get attached to it. They like it. And then when New York's like, all right, so we're thinking of extending this another 6 months. What do you think? People are like, yeah, I love it. I dig it. How do we build attachment to that, which then people don't want to be taken away? And often pilots work best. We're seeing our cities roll out a lot of pilots in this space. But when New York first announced a congestion pricing scheme, for those of you who know New York well, I texted my friends in the city, and I don't know if anyone on this call works actively with the city of New York, but when they rolled out a congestion pricing scheme, they announced it, and I texted them, I was like, wait. Why didn't we time this with some other cities so you could have like support? So you could have, Seattle could have your back or other cities could have your back, et cetera. And they're like, oh, we just wanted to move forward with whatever. And I was like, well, did you build out a public campaign? Did you build a campaign to win the hearts and minds? Because New Jersey was coming at them, the taxis were coming at them. Everyone wanted carve-outs or exemptions. And New York City was saying, oh no, we shouldn't, but we should. Can you help us build out a campaign? And so when we think about rolling out any of these big system transformations, how have we built the groundwork to win the hearts and minds? And sometimes, especially in this space, it's going to be baby steps. It's going to be building attachment, and then people are like, oh, I'm attached to it, I like it, life is better, now don't take it away from me. But in the congestion pricing scheme, especially in the United States, we see in London and Stockholm and other places in Europe, those congestion pricing schemes, those congestion zones are rolled out quite effectively. But in the US, where you don't want your rights taken away from you, how do you do it in such a way that you've built the public will in advance? A few other things here as I just finish up my presentation. Something I'm looking at actively with the cities, and I already put this in chat, in terms of behavior change. And these are either obstacles or opportunities, depending on how we approach them. But how do we change behavior, again, in an effort to win the hearts and minds and build public and political will? This is out of Helsinki. For those of you who have been in Helsinki, maybe you've seen this. Again, in thinking about behavior change and how do we change lanes pretty easily. People don't like to change the status quo. People don't like to change their behavior. So it's baby steps. We've got to make it easy. We've got to make life better. Helsinki has these little suction, these centralized vacuum systems for paper, for cartons, for compost, for glass, you name it. You pop it in there, gets sucked back to a centralized system. Super easy to do the right thing with your waste. Now, this is expensive, and this is a system set up that not all cities have. But when we think of changing behavior and building public and political will for behavior change at system scale, how do we make it fun? How do we make it easy? Sydney did this when they were greening their buildings, thinking about the power of social norming. So they were very public about this competition for greener buildings and to build more sustainable buildings in Australia. And we're very public about this leadership board, Sarah from KPMG, Wayu from Domain, Luke from Brookfield, Malcolm from JLL. As they were performing better in their buildings, again, mindful of social norming, they put up their names to appeal to ego in the race to find greener buildings in Sydney. Helsinki, again, thinking about social norming, making these behaviors easy to switch for people, building out these apps. I know a lot of you are in this space thinking about this all the time, but it's remarkable actually how much work we have to do in our cities in terms of winning the hearts and minds, making it easy, making that behavior change switch easy for folks. Lastly here, this is what our cities are doing in terms of building public and political will. They're moving more actively into co-production and engagement with the community that in a way they've never done before. This is unprecedented and new for cities to do this. But we know that if you involve someone, they learn better, they learn more quickly, not just telling, not just showing with the visuals, but engagement. So crowdsourcing, we're seeing a lot more crowdsourcing among our cities. I worked heavily with City of Cleveland in their rollout with Appreciative Inquiry. Those of you who know David Cooper Ryder at Case Western Reserve, he built out this process Appreciative Inquiry that is used with Walmart, plenty of Fortune 500s, UN as well. If you want to tap into your whole system quickly and get them on board and elicit their participation, this is one way you do it. Of course, there are many community engagement processes, but Cleveland has actively used this, and now we're rolling this out with some of our other cities so that they can actively engage whole of community quickly, again, to get buy-in for these systems changes that are necessary. This is launching, Amsterdam's launching this in early November, November 1st. I'll be there. I leave next week for Amsterdam. I'll be there for the week to monitor this and to capture some video of this. This is their citizen engagement process for their sustainability agenda, co-creating with folks in Amsterdam in terms of their sustainability plan. Glasgow is also doing this. I'll be there the following week for COP26 to capture some of this work. They're also doing a citizen assembly process, again, to get buy-in from the community so that we build public and political will. So what's exciting about this work is that cities are recognizing that they haven't done a great job of community engagement in the past. When it came to comms or media or PR, it was usually after the fact, like we've produced this product, now let's tell the public about it. Or when it was community engagement, it was usually like, hey, here's a rebate that you can take advantage of, or here's an incentive that you can take advantage of. It wasn't true engagement, and so we're seeing our cities doing a much more thorough job of engaging communities with citizen assemblies, with appreciative inquiry, et cetera. So that's all for me now. I just wanted to give a teaser and a taster on visuals that some of our cities are using. You've got the links where our cities are taking, there's a bunch of case studies in those links, especially the 12 and 12 on Carbon Neutral Cities website, of how our cities are utilizing creative communications, creative community engagement to build the public and political will. Because again, you know, we know what to do. We know what timelines we need to reach. We know the targets. We know the agendas in terms of systems change, decarbonizing buildings, transitioning transportation, certainly in the waste. We know the answers, we know the solutions, and now it's really for cities to engage in a whole new agenda for them in terms of building public and political will through more creative communications, the visuals I talked about, or through more thorough community engagement to really get the buy-in that we need. All right, that's me. Over now.
Yes, great. Thank you, Michael, and how critical communication is going to be the bridge, really, that is going to allow that change of mindset for the individual. We are now at our last speaker, Ron Dembo, and when I was preparing for this session, I actually loved, what I loved the most was how Ron described himself. So I quote word for word, he says, I'm a researcher at heart, a tree hugger, and can sit in a forest and meditate for hours. I love solving massive problems. And then as I read through Ron's bio on LinkedIn, I find his exceptional, talent sitting there. And I thought I'd share a little bit about Ron. He is the founder of Risk Thinking AI, Algorithmics, Zero Footprint. He is an academic, successful entrepreneur and consultant to some of the world's largest corporates and banks. He has a distinguished academic research career as a professor of operations research and computer science at Yale University, and as well as a visiting professor at MIT. He was the founder and CEO of Algorithmics Incorporated, growing it organically from a startup to the world's largest enterprise risk management software company, with offices in 15 countries and with over 70% of the world's top 100 banks as clients, and consistent recognition as one of Canada's 50 best managed companies. In 2005, he founded Zero Footprint, an innovative technology company focused on climate change. And during his tenure at Zero Footprint, facilitated carbon reduction programs in over 250 companies worldwide and developed innovative solutions for changing behavior. In 2018, Zero Footprint merged with CarbonX, a blockchain company, at developing innovative investment products for carbon reduction. So we have the absolute privilege to have Ron talk to us on the topic of finance and how he is measuring climate financial risk with data and analytics, and hand it over to you, Ron. Ron, you may be on mute.
Thank you for that absolutely incredible introduction. I don't believe any word of it, but I want to thank you and Ian for this opportunity. So what this is about is, how do we make our financial system completely integrated with climate risk? And the simple idea there is that if we were able to do that, we would be able to fully incentivize people correctly in terms of carbon reduction. So here are two of the most important regulators in North America, and they are talking about the potential for climate havoc. And that's an idea that's actually shared by, I'd say, 100 different central bankers, that there are potential systemic risks that could arise from climate change. So they talk about one thing that has limited the ability of people to actually do this, to actually price climate into financial markets, and that's the lack of data. How do we actually deal with this? Because this is not about data that exists. This is about data that doesn't exist. It's about data that's in the future. So there's a need to capture exposures of financial firms. There's a need to support a global way of comparing and aggregating exposures. And we need to do everything forward-looking. Climate risk is actually what's called a radical risk. So let me talk about how we are actually approaching this and how we hope to solve this problem. What is needed is really derived data. There's data that we just don't have. We need standards. There are no standards actually for how you might measure climate risk and even talk about it. We need new types of analytics. For example, if you're trying to generate scenarios on the future, it's no good having 6 people sitting around a table in Abu Dhabi and 6 in New York and expect to have some kind of consistent market mechanism. So you need those new analytics, you need new rating tools, and one thing that's absolutely essential is this all has to follow climate science. Here's the big difference between climate risk management and risk management that's done in the financial world, every single hexagon on this Earth's surface is related to every other one. They're correlated by climate science. So when you have a La Nina situation, as we have now, you get certain events happening in the West and certain in the East, but they're all correlated. They're correlated by those climate drivers. So one of the challenging things is the absolute scale of this. In order to treat this stochastically, or as a truly uncertain problem, every hexagon that you saw on the Earth's surface, and there's about 33 billion of them at a 60-meter squared resolution, is in every one of them, you have something like 25 material risk factors and 2 to the power 25, which is 33 million scenarios that are possible in combinations of those factors. So how do you even address such a problem in almost real time? And that's the challenge that we took on. So if you can do that in every single hexagon, sorry, every single hexagon.
I request someone to put their mute on, please.
If every single hexagon actually had all that information, immediately you can do things like this little bit that I talked about in the Mexican presentation. These are all the cities and all the different generating facilities. And this is what's going to happen to them over the next few years. And what you're seeing there is that Mexico City is going to be as hot as Cancun. And all of a sudden, Mexico City, without any air conditioning, is going to see many people die from heat stress. Just as what happened in Vancouver. And in 1 week, we had something like 750 people die from heat stress. So how do you actually create standards? I'm showing this deliberately because it is complex. We take every single transition scenario known to man, we align them with every financial model that generates uncertainty in the future. And we align them also with every climate model, there are 58 of them. And out we produce for every single risk factor in every corner of the world, everywhere, the future uncertainty of that risk factor. And once you have that, you're able to generate forward-looking multi-factor stress scenarios, which then give you exposure and impact. So taking those uncertainty distributions and the exposure outcomes, a set of a histogram. And some of the scenarios that generate will actually cause positive effects, and some will cause negative effects. To give you an example of this, if climate capture, which is part of the transition scenarios, was dirt cheap and ubiquitous, well, maybe the Canadian tar sands would be a good thing, but that's pretty unlikely. So we developed ratings based on this, and we're able to take, in a current situation we're looking at, which is 140 million different mortgages around the world, rating every single one of them for climate exposure. Our ratings are really simple. If you're a U3, the upside is 3 times more likely than the downside for you. And if you're a D4, the downside is 4 times more likely than the upside. Very simple English type rating. And, you know, there's a huge amount of work getting this data. There's a huge amount of work aligning it. There's a huge amount of analytics. But at the end of the day, it can look very simple. This product will come out with Bank of New York Mellon that has 40% of the world's assets under management. So you're looking at a benchmark on the left, which contains every single asset in that 40%. In other words, it's a world benchmark. And on the right, that's your portfolio and how you relate to that benchmark. And, you know, you're a D2 or a U4. So, for example, if your portfolio is a U4, as in this case, and the benchmark's a D2, you're doing a lot better in social. So we rate both policy, which affects the economy, which affects carbon, which affects climate, which affects social, and sector exposures to the financial markets. So I want to encourage you guys, think of this problem, because in the case of true financial risk management for climate, you have to go into the future and you have to deal with radical uncertainty. I wrote a book on it. I hope you read it. Thanks.
You don't have to, just say, I'm just watching a presentation.
Okay. Brian, you're on. Brian, you're
Nope,
on.
I'm not. I'm just watching the presentation you just said.
Oh, is it going to go away if I stop? To talk?
Brian, could
Nope.
I ask you to
Nope.
mute your? Can I ask you to mute your background?
Okay.
So I mean, I think you might be able to mute him as the
Oh, I
host.
might be able to. Okay, yes.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
I tried, but it won't let me. There you go.
Is he mute? Yep. Thank you all, and thank you, Ron. And I think it's a really powerful, session, especially ending this session, because we want to ensure how do you move and transform capital markets at the end of the day. And in speaking from an investor perspective and at market building perspective and the hat that I wear, I speak to pension funds about shifting their portfolios, and obviously they need the data, and also they need to see the risk in their portfolio, which ultimately impacts people who have got their savings in retirement. And so having that risk, climate risk is a financial risk, and how to shift those dollars towards solutions is going to be the key. We do have a couple of questions coming through on the chat, and I thought that we would answer those first before we do anything else. And so one of the questions is for all the panel speakers, so I do request the panel to unmute themselves. The question is, given the damning US congressional evidence of news of social media giants Facebook using flawed or vulnerable algorithms to taint the truth and values globally, how can ordinary earth ethical constituents really get politicians to tell the truth about climate degradations, and more importantly, implement critical policies here and now? So that's a pretty big question, but would any of the panel speakers like to give it a go?
Well, having been in the trenches and working with the US military and evangelical Christians and insurance companies, you have to build coalitions to really build any kind of momentum in policy circles. So it's a diverse group of like-minded people that have one outcome.
Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I'll add something really quickly. So early this year, I was talking with Senator Sanders, who is my senator. We were talking about foreign policy agendas, and I was really encouraging him down the line of climate security and really owning that narrative in the Senate to talk about climate displacement, climate migrants, climate refugees. And he was interested at the time, and now it's perhaps everyone knows the Senate is stuck thanks to Sinema and Manchin, and it's really, really unfortunate. And that's a whole ground game that's needed in those states that I can't speak to now. But I do think where possible, how do we constantly narrate the front lines of this work? And I just want to put in two things that I recently worked on with Congresswoman Clark in the House. Given, Zarmeen, what you said at the beginning of this call around displacement, and you were kind of framing up the world in which we're living now, like how do we continue to move the narrative ball, even if policy is stuck, how do we continue to move the narrative ball down the road so that we're setting the stage for the eventual movement that will happen? And I was planning to spend the next 10 years of my work with cities in mitigation, and now I find myself more quickly moving to adaptation and resilience, just because extreme weather is happening more visibly for Americans especially. But that's a tough one. I am afraid to show up with COP26, nothing in hand. I know John Kerry will try to prove something, but the US is really stuck right now and needs a strong organizing ground game in West Virginia and Arizona.
Thank you. I am going to switch the issue on some of you mentioned collaboration, and I thought perhaps some of you can actually share the innovation that's coming in relation to collaboration and the innovative ways people are coming together. And I'll share my own example. We talked about the speed and scale issue versus size and speed and scale and size and scale. I think, Will, you have that graph up there. And the way that me as a venture capital impact investor has gone about it is we are seeing also the unholy alliances come together. And by that, I mean a venture capital coming together with a non-for-profit. We're seeing philanthropic money being used as a part of a capital stack that de-risks assets. We're seeing the use of a technical assistance facility to help scale up and help the startups scale up. So I'm just wondering from your all perspectives, if you've seen any other innovative ways of collaboration and the move from competition, silos, to perhaps co-opetition, to perhaps true collaboration and partnership. So, you know, open to the panel for that, because I'd love to enable that as a post-action item from this session.
Zarmeen, just to jump in, since you referenced my slide, in the world of water, we see actually a lot of activity in multinationals working in a pre-competitive space on collective action. When I was at Deloitte, we talked about aligned action, which I believe is actually more powerful than collective action. It actually gets people to focus on very specific outcomes and make initiatives, actually, you know, make investments to that. So, you know, I think this is one of the examples where one of the issues where the water sector is actually doing a not so bad job in terms of bringing very different industry sectors and even competitors together to solve water-related issues. And there's a lot of activity going on right now with TNC in Latin America on that very issue. I would add that I believe we need to really mix it up a lot more. So, you know, this is not just the multinationals working with entrepreneurs, it's multinationals working with investors, tech transfer offices, and so on to really identify and scale solutions and bring them to the table and leverage all the attributes that every stakeholder group has.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that, Will. I mean, I think one of the things, we're working on a white paper right now, and so I've been reaching out to a number of life science, healthcare, just general stakeholders across the health ecosystem. And I think there's some really exciting opportunities when it gets to adaptation, resilience, and new business applications, because it's moving beyond just kind of the traditional siloed approach and rethinking how we deliver health and health services. So things like virtual health or new models of care, it really requires different folks coming together. So I think that's really exciting. And then in the non-competitive piece, really thinking about how health partners can come together to learn. And there's some really great examples of that happening as well.
There's also an enormous amount of collaboration on the data side. If you look at the data that we've collected tons of data from open source environments, and a lot of people will share their data. We have partnerships with data companies, people like planet.com. So we are onboarding data all the time. The UK government gave us every cement factory in the world, every steel factory in the world. The government of Finland is prepared to give me all of their open data on all of the assets, physical assets that they have, and so on. So that data is a big part of this, and getting that data collaboration right. The problem with the data is that there's tons of it, and there's tons of people willing to give you that data, but without the standards to align that data, you can't do very much. And that's the part that we've tackled.
And Ron, just in continuation with data and collaboration, we've heard about the intersection of climate and health. Just wondering how you are tackling the issue of the gender. You know, and AI, we know that, you know, with all of this fantastic ability of using AI and machine learning, the ethics of AI comes into play, as well as how the coders, you know, the diversity of coders being used, and if there's any gender stats that are being overlaid as well with some of the risk data that you're seeing. Is there any movement on that?
There's some movement on that, but you know, the issue that is very challenging is relating stuff at some future point in time when there's so much uncertainty. So that's the real issue. So if you think of things in terms of distributions rather than numbers, then it gets a little easier, because you don't necessarily trust every point in the distribution. So when we try to relate, for example, you're in Australia, we try to relate, say, biodiversity or other impacts from climate. That data doesn't exist anywhere. I mean, what's the value of a particular flood in Sydney? You know, what does that cost? And it's not a certainty. There's no certainty to that number. So once you start dealing with that uncertainty, it becomes, or scenarios, it becomes less important that every data piece is ethical or well conceived or perfect. You know, bad data in a future world is just another scenario.
I might just ask Paul, I was fascinated with the aspects of how weather is changing consumer behavior, and how that also links into, Elizabeth, the health and also the interrelationship with the communication piece. So Paul, in terms of the work that you're doing, you know, what gets measured is matters. How is that communication piece being relayed, I suppose, to the work that you're doing and the outreach that needs to happen for changing consumer behavior?
You know, one of the things that I always talk about is the fact that, especially in developed areas, we all have access to amazing information on our phones, on our mobile phones. Everybody's got a weather forecast. The weather forecasts are getting incredibly accurate, and therefore people are increasingly planning their lives and therefore their behavior based on not just the weather data, the weather actual weather, but what the prediction of the weather data is. The same is true in terms of the kind of work that we're doing in terms of providing insight into outdoor pollution levels and pollen, et cetera. So to the extent that you have insight in the palm of your hand that can translate that insight, not just into like an advertisement, which is what I used to do when I was at the Weather Channel, telling you, you know, that, or telling somebody that it was a good day for Pantene shampoo because the weather is going to cause a bad hair day, but actually providing very specific insight to somebody that perhaps they should make sure that they have that their inhaler is handy or will be handy tomorrow. I see Eric is on the line here. He does a lot of that work as well. And so what technology is enabling us to do is not just to be able to understand and measure what's happening on the ground and what's going to happen, but more importantly, to be able to communicate that in ways that sort of fits into our individual lifestyles and the way that we live our lives. And I see that increasing dramatically and around the world, and our ability to process massive amounts of data using AI, like we've just discussed, and getting better and better at being able to diagnose exactly what's happening on the ground at a very hyper-local level, and then more importantly, being able to predict what's going to happen in the next few hours or the next few days, and then even more importantly, translating into something that's meaningful, that tells somebody that they should be doing something differently or suggesting that they should be doing something differently. And all of those combined then results in what I call digital resilience, which needs to happen and is happening today because the climate is already changing and we're seeing the ill impacts of that. Somebody mentioned all of the deaths that happened in Vancouver this past summer. And so all of those things are real time. And so that's, kind of like that's an important positive opportunity in terms of our ability to leverage technology to be able to help people live better lives, which is sort of, our mantra at Barometer.
Thank you for that, Paul. And we have actually run out of time. So I'm just going to ask a quick round robin of the panel. I'll start with you, Ron. Your call to action for the rest of the group and the people that are sitting on this call.
Tell your investment advisor that they better start measuring climate risk, or they'll be left out of it.
Absolutely. Elizabeth?
I would say just take action. So I think there's, we all, and every day we're having interactions, it's just take action. Like, it's not waiting for perfect. We have enough information to really get to solutions now.
Paul?
I agree with Elizabeth. And we have the tools. We have the tools to do things today. We can't solve the problem, but each individual can live their life in a way that's more healthy and more sustainable.
Michael?
Yeah, just thinking of what we can visualize that we haven't visualized already, or what we can engage, or who we can engage in a new way that we've not engaged before. So there's always work to be done on that, and it's exciting stuff. So doing that.
Right. And I think Will I think has dropped off, I think. But look, I would like to wrap up this session because we have run slightly over time. And I wanted to really thank the fabulous panel session of experts who have, given up their time and given us great food for thought and some actions to actually fulfill going forward. There is the ClimateSavers platform to continue this discussion and ensure that this collaboration, collective action, alignment of views and actions can be taken place. So please jump onto that platform. And thank you, Ian